Welcome back to the final drop of today's splash of paint, where it's time for Malcolm Cudmore to complete his sketch of the humble cow grazing happily in the field. Enjoy.
Oh, welcome back to my picture of a cow. Well, we've already established all the main shapes. We've got a good likeness of the overall shape of the cow. I've already put in a little bit of value to represent the fact that most of my side of the cow, as I'm looking at it, is in shadow. And now I'm going to start refining those shadows. Now, I'm going to be looking all the time for what I'll define as values. Now, there's a bit of confusion in pencil drawing because people talk about shading and shadows. They say, oh, your shading's nice, or that's interesting shading. I kind of like to talk about value when I can, because everything's got value, whether it's in shadow or not. So I'm looking for some nice, clean, defined shadows at the moment. So, for example, there's one, I pointed this out earlier on, there's one certainly here that tells us that the leg is a separate thing to the udder that it's really next to. The same thing is true here. I have no idea what this part of a cow is called. A sort of neck, chesty, bulbousy thing where I suppose it stores fat or something. Certainly quite dark there. The legs at the back are a little darker because, as I've previously mentioned, not only are they in general shadow, they are also further shaded by the cow itself. So the cow itself is not only part of the cow is not being lit very significantly, but part of it is also in its own shadow. And as I say, I'm not really worrying about any of the markings at this stage because I can consider all that once I'm happy about the overall shadow shapes that define this as a three-dimensional object. And I have actually changed over to a 2B pencil. All my initial drawing was done in with an HB pencil, which is a little harder. The 2B pencil is a little softer, which means I can get a little darker with it. The values can be a little darker. I'm deliberately not being too concerned about neatness at this stage. I always like to think that if I've got 4 minutes to draw a subject, I'll get a likeness, albeit a loose one. And if I've got 20 minutes on the same subject, I'll probably get a better likeness. I like to try and get a likeness quite quickly. And so I suppose I'm working, it's a bit like focusing a pair of binoculars. The picture starts off quite out of focus and then becomes a little more focused as time goes on. Now, this part of the cow, there's this big swell of the belly here, back to these bony haunches at the back here. So actually, this part of the cow sort of goes in a little bit, and I can express that by showing a little bit more shadow in here and underneath. There's quite a lot more shadow underneath because, as I say, not only is the cow itself in shadow, but it's from the main source of light, sunlight, but it's actually creating its own shadow as well. So the bottom here is quite a lot darker, as is this lumpy thing here. It also helps to define, it's quite a subtle thing, but it helps to sort of define that this part of the sort of, I suppose, if cows have elbows, that's probably where its elbow is. Okay, let's move on here. Now, the neck here at the end of the box is fairly hollow at this point. So even though I know it's quite dark because of the dark markings, I'm going to get more tone in here, more value I should say, just to begin to show you that there's a bit of a hollow in there. It has to be said that this is quite a good looking cow, this one, if there is such a thing. The cows across the road from me are most definitely milk machines, and they're not bred for their beauty. So they tend to be quite mechanical looking, they're quite angular. I don't think they're cows that are shown in agricultural shows. They're very functional. So can you see that this part of the leg is almost, it's not exactly a flat surface, but there's a little bit more light on the front of the leg than there is on the rear of it here. So I'm going to show that with a little bit more value. So far so good. I need to get a bit darker in here as well. My marks are still quite loose. I'm quite happy for them to be loose. I quite like drawings where I can see that it was actually done by some folds in the neck here. So this is now a point where I can start thinking about that sort of level of detail. I'm probably not going to be able to get that level of detail all over, but it's kind of stretching its neck a little bit, going for that nice juicy grass. So something about the stretch there. Now it's an ear. Now the ear here is, it's got a tag on it, but it's mostly in shadow, but there's a fringe of light that sort of defines its back edge here. So I'm going to get nice and dark in here. It's nice and dark behind the ear as well. These lines are quite loose. I'm just going to show you a technique in a minute for helping to... so we know this part of the cow is technically white, but it's nearly all in shadow. So I'm going to get quite a bit of strength of value in here. I'm going to be adding the markings on the top of this, which means that they're going to be appropriately dark, if that makes sense. So let's get a bit more shadow in here as the nose narrows. There's not much definition about the nose here. I'm not going to show its mouth is sort of hidden by the grass, and time allowing I will aim to get just a little bit of a hint of the grass in here. Okay, now I've got some value in that sort of expresses the overall three-dimensional nature of this cow. I can start thinking about, oh, I've got its tail. Let's get a bit of shadow into the tail here as well. And the tail is behind this leg, so things get darker as they move away from the light, and this is obscured not only from the main light but also by the shadow forming by its tail here. Okay, so far so good. I'm going to define this eye a little bit more. Artistic license now, because actually in the actual photograph it's quite hard to define where its eye is, but I do want to give the cow a little bit of character so you can actually see it as a live animal. Okay, now before I start putting any markings on, I'm going to use this as a paper stump, and I'm just going to use this to help soften some of the marks that I've made here. I'm going to sort of blend things. I don't want to blend everything away, but I want to just soften everything a little bit. That's why I wasn't overly bothered about how much the markings showed up, the individual marks that I was making. So this is just going to soften everything a little bit, and I'm going to put the actual markings of the cow. What this is doing is just moving the graphite around a little bit on the paper. This is a nice paper, by the way. It's a nice smooth paper. It's actually a watercolour paper designed for wet media, but perfect for drawing on, because it's got quite a smooth surface, and because graphite itself is a pretty smooth medium, I can move it around with this paper stump and get a bit of blending in here. And that helps me to sort of, if I want to push this bit back a little bit, add a little bit more value and just give it a good smooth around with the paper stump. Okay, right. Looking a bit cow-like. So this is how I'm going to approach the markings. I'm going to be fairly random about them. I'm not going to be too bothered about specifically following exactly the markings on this individual cow. But as I've already got some shading in here, a bit of value on this side, by putting the markings on top, they're going to go even darker. If I put markings here, for example, a patch here that is both in the light and in the shade, even though we know it's black, the bit that's in the light is not quite the same value as the bit that's in the shade. And getting the overall sort of three-dimensional values of the cow correct in the first place means that I can begin to apply these markings, and their values are going to be right as well. Okay, got lots of markings here, and I'm making them fairly random. Sorry about that, Mrs. Cow. But you're no longer an individual. You become just any old cow. Sorry about that. But here we are. Once again, I'm going to use the paper stump to help me push some of this dark in. And there's a big dark patch here on the neck. And we're going to get all this in, do my best. Being pretty random about it all. Plenty of value. And because this is very dark, I'm going to go for an even darker pencil now. This is actually a 6B pencil, because I know that in the neck there, everything's just a little bit darker still because of the shadow. If I'd had 45 minutes to work on the drawing, we'd have got to an even greater level of detail. Here we go. More dark markings on here. Dark inside the ear. Big dark patch around its eye. And some splodges on its nose. And under its chin. Variegated cow. And I think we're beginning to look definitely as if it's a Frisian, which I think is the brand of cow. Just blend those in a little bit. Given more time, I could begin to look in a lot more detail at the specific shapes of the markings. Oh, now, actually it's quite nice that I've made a mark like that, because I can show you that I do quite a lot of tidying up at the end of a picture. This is a lump of, it's actually a mix of blue and white tack. It's quite adhesive. It's very good for graphite work. It helps me to tidy things up. I can remove the general smudging that I've with my hand here. I quite like to define some of these with a bit more time, but that may not be possible. And I also do use these electric erasers as well. Now the electric erasers are very handy for quite specifically drawing in little bits of light where I've perhaps been a bit too generous with my values. So I use anything that works, and that's lots of erasers, lots of electric erasers, and blue tack and whatever else I can find that will do the job for me. Sometimes even with fingers. If you haven't got a paper stump, then use your finger. Tidying up, just a little indication that actually some of these hooves are in grass. Now, obviously I can't draw every single blade of grass here, but I can indicate that just there's some shadow where the hoof is behind the grass. It's going to be a little darker than it is. Not actually individually drawing every blade of grass, but I do want to just hint at the fact that there are shadows on the hooves which are caused by the grass. The same actually with its nose in the grass here. So, very quick indication of our grazing cow. Tidy it up just a little bit. And because I've got a bit of a time limit, I'm still very happy that I've actually expressed something about the shape and demeanour of this particular cow. You know, given another half hour, the cow would be even more detailed. But if I can encourage you to do anything, start loose, get tighter according to time. And there's our cow. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'm sure you'll agree. There's lots of super tips and encouragement there to pick up a pencil and start drawing. Now, before we end today's programme, we've just got time to answer a few viewers' questions. First of all, a question, can you copy somebody else's painting and then sell it? The quick answer is no, basically, but if you do get permission from the artist to do that, then that's something what is quite acceptable. Secondly, can masking fluid be used with acrylic paints, or does it only work with watercolour? It depends how you use the actual acrylics. If you use the acrylics in a water-based way, like watercolour, which is perfectly acceptable to do, then of course masking fluid would work. But if you're using the acrylics thick and opaque like oil paint, then there's no point, because the acrylic will just cover the masking fluid up. If you've got any questions yourself, don't be afraid to send us an email, folks, to asplashofpaint@saa.co.uk. And that's all for today, and I'll see you next time.
All the products featured on A Splash of Paint are available from the SAA Home Shop. Visit www.saa.co.uk and discover special discounted offers and free delivery on over 16,000 top quality brand name art products and supplies.